I'm going to present this study by this structure. The main emphasis will be in number 4, the maps, because of its complexity. I say, please hold your questions if I don't answer them along the way. Your interest in this subject might be personal, but mine is academic. As a military career analyst, I instinctively question claims based on secondary sources. In the age of Google, there are lots of sources out there, and a lot of them are unreliable, and so this warning is presented in case I disagree with you. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a general description of the development of the colony. It will be technical with respect to chronology, but it will be subjective with respect to causes, and for that, I freely admit that would be conjecture. Can't go without acknowledging sources. I pushed the button too many times. These sources are the printed ones. There are many others. Some among you here, also those who have long since worked, Kemper, Dr. Holtzclaw, Dr. Hackley, John Blankenbaker, and all the contributors to his organization and his Beyond Germanna. These are the 4 formal ones, essential for detail analysis, and most of what I'm going to cover is not new, but drawn from them. But it does not reconcile all original details either. What I'm going to offer here is a new packaging using the sequence of a settlement to study its nature. I'm going to begin with the assumption that most, but not all, in this study, in this audience, are familiar with the term Little Fork Colony. Therefore, I hope you'll suffer for a short overview. This is the common gloss. There are at least 2 versions of the common gloss of this particular colony, but for reasons which I think will become obvious after the presentation, I don't believe any one of them is precisely accurate. I start by asking several questions, which invariably lead to more questions. In the move to Germantown, did these German immigrants know of the Fairfax proprietary dispute? Were they seeking escape from the Crown control, or did they fear any risk in that rejection? Were any of the initial Little Fork German grants from Fairfax, as were the Germantown grants? And if the 1734 immigrants were a major impetus for the Little Fork colony, were they intended for the colony from the beginning? And was that because Germantown was full? Was it because Holtzclaw simply was helping friends? Or was his intent primarily to make money? Or all of the above? What date should be used as the beginning of the Little Fork colony? There is evidence for pre-1728, 1728 itself, 30, 34, late 1730s, early 40s, 47, 48. I could argue all of those dates. Was there a planned land use pattern, structure for the colony, as with Germantown? Was access across the river a factor? Did the roads simply follow fence lines? When did the 2 roads cross, which ultimately created the largest town in the county, except for the courthouse? What were the expectations of the settlers? Was it for interim habitation or permanent major homesteads? When did further dispersion occur, before or after the Revolution, and why? And what was the interaction with English settlers, with the Patriots, with Baptists? Any examination of settlement requires an understanding of the land acquisition process at that time. This is the sequence described well by Robert Vernon in John Blankenbaker's Beyond Germanna. Note that the word grant does not appear anywhere in this sequence, a term we frequently use. The Crown actually issued patents, which were a little bit different. We are also aware that much time would pass between steps in which both settlers and speculators could game the system. So although I will use the term grant with specific dates for convenience, please keep in mind that the actual situation on the ground could vary widely from year to year. Serious students of these matters will recall the near century-long conflict over the Fairfax Proprietary. The dispute rested on which of two river branches was the main course of the Rappahannock, and that was because of the wording of the Proprietary awarded to Lord Fairfax. If I can find my image button here, the words in highlight here are the key words in this particular document. As it turns out, at the time of this initial award, no survey had established which was the exact main course of the Rappahannock River. This is a 1791 map. It's almost sideways because they published it sideways in the book to get it there, but I've got it with north directly up. The Fairfax heirs and assigns claimed that the main course of the Rappahannock, which would encompass the southern boundary, therefore, was what we today call the Rapidan River down here, on the southern boundary of the county, Culpeper County. Naturally, the Crown wished it to be the northern course from this point here on up. For orientation purposes, the original Germanna settlement was right here. Fairfax, as we know today, actually had the losing argument, but his surveyors made a more professional presentation, thereby folding the future Culpeper, Rappahannock, and Madison counties into his claim. Little Fork is one of many geographic terms of convenience used by the earliest surveyors to identify general locations. In this case, the juncture of the Hazel River with the Rappahannock. On this map is right here. All of that area between those, therefore, were the Little Fork. That was to distinguish the area from the Great Fork down below, where the Rapidan itself meets the Rappahannock. In typical fashion, the earliest patents and grants worked their way north from the Germanna frontier almost immediately after Germanna was deemed secure. For orientation purposes, this is the Hazel River going off the map down below. That's the Rappahannock going up there. The center today is the village of Jeffersonton. You see here, by 1728, there were 5 English grants north of the Little Fork itself. Robert Beverly, William Beverly, Willis, Bledsoe, and Rachel Russell. Now, the only coherent way to cover the key events is chronologically. So in order to reconstruct the county's development, I'm going to discuss events in a sequence in which they relate to that colony. If you're familiar with Dr. Holtzclaw's 1960 essay on the colony, please keep in mind that his sequence there was to show functional relationships between families and not as a timeline. Early researchers associated Jacob Holtzclaw, the 1740 immigrant, with a 1724 grant for what became the Ashland homestead in western Fauquier. December Barbara Price knows that it was originally a Martin grant sold in 1768, 44 years afterwards, to a Joseph Holtzclaw. That location is about 15 miles west of Germantown, and just 5 miles shy of the Little Fork across the river by way of Sandy Ford. It is tantalizing to think that perhaps someone in the colony did the step 1 land location reconnaissance from this Ashland area. We may never know. But 4 years later, in 1728, Jacob Holtzclaw himself obtained the first German grant in the Little Fork for 680 acres. In 48, he expanded that to 1,300. To show the development of the colony, I chose to construct a number of new maps, and so I naturally had to first check out those already done. In addition to this one, which I call the free-floating Hackley mosaic, Hackley also made overlays showing, and I'll return to this by the way, showing major waterways such as this Generation 1 map about 1958. And later, as he continued, this Generation 2 map, also showing the rivers roughly. John Blankenbaker made this overlay for his newsletter. All these maps are different in subtle but significant respects. To determine which was correct in order to continue, I had to create this survey using Holtzclaw's 1748 survey points, the entire 1,300 acres, but which incorporated the first. I've done surveys, and this one closes well. That is to say, following the compass headings and lengths, you end up exactly where you started. And except for one angle, this one down here, this one showed the Hackley's free-floating mosaic version indicates Holtzclaw's patent in the exact same shape here, shown here. The other maps are useful for relationship details, but none good enough for a specific layout on the ground. In particular, those river traces are too rough. Now, somebody's going to say, this diagram is tilted. Somebody please say that. There's a reason for that. Today's surveys use true north. Back then, they used magnetic north. So any layout is always going to be a few degrees difference. And you'll see that in the subsequent maps. Unfortunately, even the free-floating mosaic does not match everything. Hackley could not do that even though he had access to topo maps in the 50s. But for this study, I've used modern GIS and county overlays to reconcile the old plats with terrain features and current property lines. The most straightforward start is to use Holtzclaw's survey and the longest run, a 360 pole line, which is this one on the bottom. That's about 1.2 miles. And there's only one place to put that because it says it runs due east, magnetic, along William Beverly's land, which was well known. By placing the trace on the modern map and by not matching the known scales, at least 4 of the 11 runs match the current property lines. The mosaic does begin to deviate at distances beyond 1 mile for other reasons. I'm going to point out quickly where the matches are. That is directly on current lines. So is this one. So is that one. There's one up here as well. And at this point here, the dotted line represents subsequent subdivisions. You'll see here there are a variety of lines now diverging. At that time, there are only a few. And there is this particular object. That is an extreme wide angle lens to capture the scope of that tree, but it is 14 plus feet in circumference. And therefore, crude dendrochronology puts the date of this tree at about 1718 plus or minus 20 years. That division point was 1748, so the tree would have been 30 years old. And if you look at those surveys, they frequently say a group of 3 oaks, a group of 3 pines, or a group of 2 hickories and a pine. There's another one, very large one, right nearby. Mr. Blankenbaker performed a number of the plots, as I'm doing here, and provided a good summary in his Beyond Germanna. He also noted that many grants do not harmonize with each other's lines and had to be adjusted over time. And that's because starting points were not always exact, and distances invariably were full rods. That's 16.5 feet. Today we measure surveys to the nearest 1/100th of a foot. It would take several hundred hours of painstaking reconstruction from about a dozen additional surveys to get this straight. For my purposes here, to show only the sequence, that level of detail is not necessary. This shows, in addition to Holtzclaw on the GIS map, the initial grant patent for Fischbach. And I point out that Holtzclaw has not put anybody on this land and does not for quite a few years. I'll return to that point later. This is 1730, Johann Fischbach obtains the grant here, and Hackley's schematics imply that the north line is in fact the baseline, working down. although Mr. Blankenbaker notes the extreme indefinite nature of this particular patent, and that Fishback's grant was in fact not finalized until his son did it 18 years later. Jumping ahead, this shows the full Fishback plot, and I'll point out here how this also matches well with current features today. Note how the subsequent road runs right alongside his fence line. That line is directly on existing plots today. Note down here how it wraps around an existing lot or parcel today. Hackley's schematics were close, and this matches also items such as the streams. If you'll notice very carefully, the small dotted lines here are streams. I was always confused why these subsequent dotted line parcels were converging at this point here. It's because he was trying to parcel out water rights around this particular stream, which is Little Indian Run, by the way. Likewise, Fishback took all three major heads for what was then known or became known as Deathridge Run. So I start with these two and build outwards, shifting now back to the scale to accommodate the full colony. In 1730, the pattern is already clear here. Note how the German locations differ from the prior English grants. The Germans had taken the high ground directly between the two rivers, centering on stream origins, or what they called the drains, whereas the English were working off the major rivers, which they thought might be transportation, and envisioned larger plantations. No changes occur for another 5 years, at least not in the record. 3 more English do show up. Here is shown Deathridge wrapping around the outside of Fishback's first claim. This is 1735. This plot also, of course, shows those alternate divisions on Holtzclaw's land extending beyond where he has it in 1728. This is supposed to show, yes, Tapp here, another Englishman, coming up against what Fishback had not yet fully taken, and Willis, the same one from over here, who has now leapfrogged over Holtzclaw. This is 1736. The simple, clear distinction in choice of land differentiates the intents of the two classes of grantees. The English took the large parcels of land for the navigable rivers, as they had done also in the James and the York and the Lower Rappahannock River. The Germans were planning to develop land, we assume, by and of themselves or their countrymen, and to settle down and to raise families for the indefinite future, that is, create a community. There are no further reports, documents, grants, or deeds, or leases of any sort regarding any actual inhabitants in the Little Fork until late in the 1730s. But about 30, it is noted that the Church of England's St. Mark Parish was reset to consist of 3 new chapels of ease, including Oak Shade, which was barely a quarter of a mile north of the Hazel River and only 1.5 miles from Holtzclaw's grant. This was not necessarily an aggressive move. The authorities wanted the land settled, and there were English settlers to serve, even in the early 30s. The records also explicitly state that the Germans would not be charged tithings if they had their own pastor. But I note that even the pastor himself, Reverend John Thompson, took land up here in 1748. The next event occurs 1734, when the ship Hope arrives at the Chester port of debarkation south of Philadelphia. Had 20 people from Nassau-Siegen. Kemper notes that Holtzclaw was behind this initiative. Of this group of 20 individuals, 18 appear in the colony in subsequent years. But I ask, why did Holtzclaw arrange for this group? Dr. Holtzclaw says that people went almost directly to the Little Fork, but where? There's no documentation for another few years. Also in these intervening years, 36 and 37, the Crown, back up off that, the Crown and Fairfax both sent teams to survey the rivers, leading to the ultimate decision regarding the proprietary, which came 8 years later. Before sending the surveys back to England, both sides made presentations to the authorities down in Williamsburg. Keep in mind that everyone knew and agreed that the land east of the Rappahannock River could be granted by Fairfax. On the west side, the Crown was issuing grants. And the German town site indicates that the Germans preferred to avoid the Crown, or could be implied. It's difficult to imagine why Holtzclaw and Fishback took the earlier grants on the west side, those first two on the maps I showed. But conjecture, lobbying, or even leaks by people associated with these surveys may have influenced the next moves. There were lots of ships going to America, but not all of them to Virginia. In 1738, a group of 50 individuals sailed from Nassau-Siegen to Georgia. They didn't like the weather down there and left very soon. From that well-preserved roster, 9 people of 5 families appear in the Little Fork colony in 1739 and 1740. That's Wehmann, Hoffman, Bach, and Mueller. Turning to the map here to show what it looked like in 1739. The addition here of an Englishman, Chisholm, implies that Willis did not, in fact, seat his land properly, at least not yet. Also, George Wehmann, who had just arrived in 39, a year before, 38, leased land from William Beverly. This is strange. Why not lease from Holtzclaw in the first place, since he already had that patent? It could be that Holtzclaw had already made commitments to friends who had arrived earlier, the 34 group, even though they weren't situated. Now, these 5 German families are the ones who appear in various records in the Little Fork in 1739, 5 German families. And I'll turn back to the map to discuss them. Holtzclaw, and I'm going to turn back to the map. Holtzclaw paid for 4 tithables that is shown from 39 on, and it's fair to assume that they were the same 4 to whom he deeded land 9 years later in 1748. There's no indication of where they started at 39. Those dotted lines could be the locations, which were then simply extended further north once he had finished the full grant. If I can find that list. The 4 tithables were Jung, Hoffman, Bach, and Fischbach. The dates indicate their birth years to avoid confusion if you're trying to make notes with others with the same name. Note, however, from those dates, they are generally a second generation or a generation beyond the 1714 group, who were adults, of course, when they arrived. Miller has an asterisk next to his name because he's not shown. There were only 4 titles being shown. However, Miller is known to have leased land somewhere from Holtzclaw. On the Fishback property, I want to turn back the map. Right here, you'll see 2 asterisks. This is the Fishback property. This was Bach. That's where Wehmann moved later after this one. This was Jung, eventually. This is Hoffman. And over here became Miller. This was only filled up much later on. On the Fishback land is this particular object. It was listed in the 1937 WPA files, but not fully located. It was only identified by Dr. Holtzclaw in 1960. Above that, the other asterisk, this is, shows a foundation in this particular shape. Hackley and Dr. Holtzclaw found in the 1950s and thought it was the long-lost Reformed church noted by the missionary Gottschalk in 1748. I was suspicious, and Don Tharp, who I think is here also, was pretty sure it is more likely a dwelling. Note the features. It is 12 by 32. There is a well over here, a pile of bricks up this side, which is downwind, it turns out, would have been the location for a outside chimney, an outside kitchen with chimney. These are the chimney stones falling off the backside of the center of the property. Neither, as I say, Holtzclaw nor Hackley recorded the precise locations for these objects, and even local hunters did not know of them. I found them almost by accident. Huffman, Young, and possibly the new fishbacks had arrived in the 34 ship Hope. Why did it take them 5 years to show up in the Little Fork? I don't have an answer to that question at this time. Turning now to the north end of the colony, that larger second grant to Johann Fischbach, is even more complex. He was a close associate of Holtzclaw, another of the first three released from indenture, and with 1730, he recorded that patent for 400 acres. That was, of course, the maximum for a single head right when they began to enforce it. But 3 years later, he died, and it's not clear whether he had ceded the grant. His son Frederick inherited the land, but was not yet of age to hold the clear title. He was, as they say, connected. He married Anne Elizabeth Holtzclaw, and this marriage may have breathed new life into the Lonesome Six on and near his father-in-law's land to the southeast. We know for sure that Frederick expanded his holdings by regrants in 1747 and 48. As a hypothesis, it is possible that this is an example of maintaining legal interests in a piece of land before obtaining a final grant. The so-called re-grant incorporates the earlier ones, and it appears that both Holtzclaw and young Fischbach may have used this method to avoid interim ceding requirements, but it takes cooperation and risks interlopers, a real possibility here. But Holtzclaw's power, influence, reputation, and money could have helped a lot. Dr. Holtzclaw and Hackley have hypothesized that the early families, some early families, may also have lived on Fischbach's land before the legal paperwork was straightened out and gradually obtained grants nearby. I have not found any records to indicate that. And why would they move? Did young Fischbach simply allow them to use his land temporarily because Germantown was full and they didn't have the ability to obtain grants on their own? That's possible. But it would mean they both have to clear and build a second time later on. And how did young Fischbach plan to cultivate 400 acres? He apparently wasn't thinking of leasing it out, as did Holtzclaw. He would have to have had help. I repeat again at this point, I have not yet located direct record of Germans living in the Little Fork colony before the year 1739. That doesn't mean they were not there, just that there's no extant file of patents, leases, or quit rents to show it, no hard evidence. Then again, there are very few such books remaining. For 2 days in November 1743, Moravian missionaries from Pennsylvania, Leonard Schnell and Robert Hussey, traveled through and stayed with Holtzclaw over in Germantown. They were shown letters from Henry Huffman, who it is said lived, quote, 10 miles away. Dr. Holtzclaw assumed this was an indirect reference to the Little Fork colony. There's an error here somewhat in that account because Huffman's track is 20 miles from Licking Run. It could probably be a legibility issue. But by 1745, it does appear very likely that at least half a dozen German families have been struggling in this area for 5 or 6 years already, even though presumably the patrons, Holtzclaw and Fischbach, did not know for sure whether their grants would be later validated by the Crown or by Fischbach. This is a strange situation. It's always seemed that they wanted to escape Crown control, so why would they invest across the river unless they felt they'd be okay and or under Fairfax's ultimate control? At any rate, in London on the 6th of April, 1745, Fairfax v. Virginia was decided, and Fairfax received his entire claim, 5.3 million acres. 9 future counties, including Culpeper, Madison, and Rappahannock. Once the case was settled, Fairfax said he would honor grants made by the Crown in his land. So perhaps the Germans were like Sooners in that territory, and Fairfax had been spreading the word all along that things were going to work out, making folks like Holtzclaw confident in those investments. Didn't take too long for the decision to take effect. No less than 5, possibly 6 additional German families made firm commitments in 1747. I spend a few more bullets on Spillman because his is a complicated name. There being 2 branches of the German family and 2 branches of the English in the same area. This James is son of Johann, the 1714 immigrant. This James was appointed overseer of the road. He married in 1745 about Martha Wayman, whose stone has been found on the property, which was in fact the old Wayman property. He assumed Wayman's debt on that property, that 100 acres, at this time, and was granted and bought several parcels later. His son, a man named Thomas, became a Culpeper sheriff and a trustee of all the Little Fork towns. Another son, John, was Jefferson's schoolmaster and ancestor of Woodford Hackley. Descendants Suddes, Harris continue in the area today. But this is not the Spillman Park Spillman. That was a nephew, John, born in 1740, son of John, the older brother of this James. John, that other John's branch of the family had developed association with land up on the extreme opposite end of the colony beyond Fishback, more than 3 miles away. In a subsequent generation, that nephew's son Conway married into the Fishback family, and so that John is buried at Fleetwood. The 5 or 6 more names are shown here with their birth dates. Heimbach is shown with an asterisk because, although we know he leased land from Holtzclaw, we're not exactly sure at this time, no. The indefinite point on Heimbach is that we know he leased land because he deeded land later, saying that he had already been on the land back at this time. So I don't put them exactly on the 1747 sequence, except with an asterisk. Here in this map now is 1747, showing the additions of Spillman, who has taken over Wilman's parcel, who has subsequently moved back up into Holtzclaw's land. Also, in the very center, Grimm and Kuntz, taking identically sized plats of 127.5 acres each. Obviously, there's some cooperation here.